Good morning. It's Saturday. I should come up with a new way to introduce the videos. Anyway, good to see you. It's a new day. I'm very excited again because this week we're going to talk about Briar Rose or Sleeping Beauty. And again, it's just so fascinating when I dive into a new story that not new, but a story that I've looked at before and kind of refresh it in my mind. I am really fascinated by the depth of what's being revealed. And especially with this story, what came was the relevance to what's happening in our culture today. Now, I'm most familiar with what's happening in the States, but to some degree, it's certainly happening in other areas as well, meaning the feminine and what's happening with the feminine in our culture. So that really makes this story much, well, I don't know if I should say more relevant, but so relevant to what's happening today, because the only way to change the culture is through changing ourselves. And this story, once again, as another fairy tale, gives us these step-by-step instructions. It's fascinating to think that these stories were passed down generation to generation by word of mouth. I mean, it's really stunning because it would have put those blueprints into the DNA, into the unconscious for centuries. Centuries. And when the Grimm brothers came along, they felt like these stories were being lost. And they began to go around and collect these stories from the storytellers because they were afraid. It was, again, how amazing is that? You know that this was like some kind of divine intervention to bring these stories then to us today, where we're more equipped with the symbolism and the understanding of symbolism and the ways of disseminating information that made this so relevant to today and so needed for today. So we talked last week about the beginning of the story, where the king and queen are waiting for a very long time to have a baby. They get the message that they're going to have one within a year, and then the queen gives birth to the young feminine. And the king wants to celebrate, have a big party, but he only has 12 plates, and there are 13 wise women. So the 13th wise woman gets excluded. So we're at the celebration, and the 12 wise women are bestowing their gifts. That's why they're there. They're there to bestow their gifts on the young feminine. And each one gives these, good things, these good girl qualities. You're going to be beautiful, and you're going to be wealthy, and you're going to have virtue, and all these nice qualities and everything a person could wish for. Then the 13th wise woman comes in, right? Dressed reminiscent so much of Beast in Beauty and the Beast, and just comes tearing in, just raging and angry. And, she's excluded. She's the one that's been rejected. She's the one that's been isolated and left out. And she's going to curse the baby. She's going to make it so that when the child turns 15, she will prick her finger on a spindle and she will die. What's interesting about the 13th fairy is we talked last week about 13 being associated with the divine feminine, 13 moon cycles, right? So we look at it and we say, what is it about this particular character that is so different? She's refusing to remain silent, small, hidden, right? That's what would be accepted. She would be like perceived as a disaster coming in, right? Not going along with the agenda, not playing along with the status quo, not just accepting what happens and just remaining silent and quiet in the corner. She speaks up. She speaks the truth, knowing knowing to the king, right? Who else is going to do that? That takes a lot of courage to actually speak up to the authority. He represents the patriarchal authority, and she does so fearlessly. Can you imagine? I mean, like, really think about that. They're in the big celebration. He's so thrilled. He has a daughter, and this child they've waited for so long. And she comes in, and she's like, yeah, you know what? I have the power to make that all go away. And I am. And so he has to face the fact that this aspect of the feminine he has no control over. He can't do anything about this. So essentially, she has power. So she has the truth, which is the nature of reality, which is that the feminine is empowered. She has power. She is abundant. She does not have limits, is infinite. This is why, if you look back in history, there were periods where women were perceived as such a threat to authority. Right? Why? Because they understand the truth that has been concealed, that has been hidden, that has been this idea that women are not powerful, that we don't have power. And she represents that aspect of the feminine that does, that refuses to go along, that refuses to be silent. That doesn't mean it's about this rebellious spirit that's going to go out into the world and, take names. But it represents an inner reclaiming, an inner return to the truth. Because then that changes the outer experience. It changes the outer world. So you can see how critical this is right now. This is a key to the feminine not going back into the unconscious at 15. She's the key to the feminine not being lost for another generation or 2 generations or 3 generations. So this is a key, and this is why I'm saying it's so important for us right now if you just read the news. So at 15 is a transitory period, right? It's like when a girl is shifting from girlhood into maidenhood, into more of a woman. It's a transitory period. And so we've seen this in other stories, how there are these like critical points in the emergence of the feminine, in the evolution of consciousness. So this is a critical point. And this would be a moment when there would be like, either she's going to come out of this, or she's going to stay in it. So we talked before about the king and queen has a problem with generativity. This is why, because this is showing us that here is the pattern. The 13th fairy represents fate. I'm sorry, I keep calling her a fairy. I'm not sure why. The 13th wise woman represents the intervention of fate in order to break the pattern. That is the family pattern that causes the feminine to not survive this critical point. So she will come out of the unconscious, the young feminine, the princess, when she sees the truth and deals with the qualities of the 13th wise woman. 13th wise woman is a key to the divine feminine, emerging, empowered, whole, and free. So this is a reclaiming of that. She refuses to remain silent. She speaks up, which connects her back to that frog, which we talked about, right? That he had the voice. He represented that voice of speaking and expression. And so here we have this tie-in now between her and that first initial symbol. Why this is also a key is because what isn't seen, what isn't heard, what is rejected, what isn't valued and acknowledged ends up going back into the unconscious. Then it's often projected. So if the power isn't reclaimed inside, it's projected outside. And then the belief is that something outside has more power, has power over, has the ability to determine your well-being, or in this case, the well-being of the princess. And what we see here is the belief right now is that the 13th fairy, this fairy, wise woman, this outer character has the ability to determine the fate and the well-being of the princess on the one hand. On the other hand, this is an aspect of her. So what's been rejected must be accepted so that it doesn't go back into the unconscious, so that it doesn't stay in the unconscious. It has to be retrieved. So accept the rejected parts, and then they don't have to conform for acceptance. See? She's not conforming, the 13th wise woman. She's not conforming. She doesn't care if she's accepted. She doesn't care. She's going to say what she said. She's going to speak the truth. She's going to speak the truth to authority. It doesn't matter to her. And so again, this is remembering initially this is an inner journey, not an outer journey. So it's what's the authority inside of me that I need to speak up to? What's the authority that's been in charge, that I've been listening to, that may not actually be for my highest good and best interest? Here in this story, we see the king as the authority has to be challenged. So if she plays the good girl, she's probably not going to honor herself. And so if this 13th wise woman didn't show up, she would have probably been like the good girl, and then something in her would have remained in the unconscious, and she wouldn't have been true to herself. So through doing this work, she'll be free to be who she is, out of the box, a woman unto herself, right? That's a virgin, a woman unto herself. She's not beholden to anybody. She's sovereign. She's free. She's independent, fully expressed, and empowered. So at this point, the 13th wise woman puts her curse on the princess, but as luck had it, the 12th wise woman hadn't given her blessing yet. So she's able to step in and soften the blow of the curse of the 13th wise woman. And so what she says is she can't take it away, but what she can do is soften it so that the young girl doesn't die, but in fact, she just goes to sleep for 100 years. Culturally, what this means is that for a period of time, the feminine has gone into the unconscious. And we've talked about this. It's been such a long time that in a lot of ways, it's been really an unearthing, which has been going on for a while now, where women have been trying to understand what has happened, what has gone into the unconscious, what do we need to reclaim, what has been deemed unacceptable, unworthy, and wasn't valued, that now we need to figure out. It's been, as I've said before, so long that oftentimes it's not even recognized as gone. It's so forgotten. It's so buried in memory and history and the cells there's this little kind of inkling, that for many of us, that when we tried to adhere to the culture's expectations, there was something inside of us that wouldn't be silent, that refused to go along. That little something that for me was, that corporate job, that little voice was like, this isn't right. And the part of me that was going to get married, that did get married, and was in a corporate marriage with a corporate husband and kind of living that lifestyle, that little voice was like, this isn't quite right. And then when I tried to get a degree in counseling psychology, a master's degree, it was like, this isn't quite right. And so it was like not knowing what was right, what was the path, but knowing that something felt off and not understanding it, but knowing what I was in wasn't it. So it's that voice is that 13th fairy, that seed, that knocking on the door, that saying, you know what? There's something more. Life, this isn't the way life has to be. And it's not that there was anything terrible or destructive about it or anything. It was, according to society standards, it was incredibly lucky. It was as lucky as you could get. But that soul, that part of you that wants to be expressed and heard and lived, if you're lucky, won't go to sleep, won't stay silent, even if it's just a little tiny voice that says, not quite this. Then we listen and we move forward, even if we don't know what that means, even if we don't know how that's going to work, how that can happen, right? So the 12th wise woman softens the curse, and the maiden will sleep for 100 years. So the feminine in the culture has been asleep for more than 100 years in the unconscious. So she's not going to die. She's just going to go into the unconscious for a period of time, a cycle. This is a protective mechanism, which is really fascinating, right? Because even if you look at it historically, that this, you could say that this was a negative thing, but you could also say that the fact that the feminine went into the unconscious for this period was a time of protection for that aspect of the feminine. You could see when she was in her power during that period, it didn't end well for her. So being in the unconscious really was the safest place for her until the time came for her to actually emerge. And hopefully we are in that period right now. So she goes into the unconscious until the right time, personally and culturally. So you'll see this possibly in your own life. And it can feel like a long time, right? So if it's personal and it's 100 years, it can feel like, man, this is taking forever. But persistence and patience are so important to discovering the truth inside. So for us, what do we look at? Are we putting our brakes on before we share our gifts or sharing ourself? Like what does this period in the unconscious mean? Are we playing the role of good and then projecting rejected, or feeling that way, or ignoring what's deemed negative in ourselves? Anger, rage, talents, power, wholeness, freedom, love, abundance. All these things are truth. They're true aspects of who we are. So the anger and rage and all of that isn't necessarily truth, other than the fact that it may be what we're actually feeling, but holding inside because it's unaccepted. The more that we accept it and allow it and work through it, the less hold it has on us, because it's not necessary. Because as you move through those things, you're regaining your power, because the rage and the anger comes from, in the case of the 13th wise woman, in a sense, what it represents is the rage and the anger to the king for the exclusion, for the rejection. And so on one level, that's historically true. On one level, that might be personally true. But on another level, it's a projection of power. And so the more that that's taken back, okay, I am angry, I am raging about this, and process it in a safe and healthy way without projecting it out into the world, is taking back all of it, the power included. So she takes back has to integrate the qualities of the rejected wise woman to awaken and emerge. which is the dark feminine, which is so interesting, right? Because we've talked before about how the dark feminine, specifically, initially we spoke about Psyche and Amor and that story, and how Venus was the divine feminine who was rejected, neglected, and ignored. There you go, in favor of the earthly feminine, Psyche. And that was a transitory point in the story from myth to fairy tale, and she disappeared. That was the last time we had this divine feminine. So the 13th wise woman represents that rejected divine feminine who we saw in Venus, who we see still now manifested as the jealous sisters in Cinderella, the jealous sisters in Psyche and Amor, the old woman in Rapunzel. We have the sisters in Beauty and the Beast. We have doubled a lot, which we talked about is key to individuation. We have the witch in Hansel and Gretel who eats the children, which is really, right, so similar to this situation. What keeps this movement of the feminine into the outer world? In that case, it was her. In this case, it's the 13th wise woman. So what does the dark feminine and the 13th wise woman and these characters, the dark feminine characters, represent, right? The jealous sisters, the jealous stepmother, all of that. The old women, the witches. When we talked about Cinderella, of the stepmother, and what happened to her? That's what's important here to understand, especially for in our own lives. What happened to that stepmother to make her the way that she is? All we need to do is look at the 13th wise woman. That's why she's angry. That's why she's vengeful. That's why she's resenting life. And this is exactly what happens, and why at 15 the feminine goes into the unconscious and doesn't come out if she has a stepmother, a mother, a caregiver who has not been able to emerge herself, who has let go of parts of herself to conform to society's expectations. And that little voice that I talked about, that I heard and listened to in the corporate job, in the marriage, the corporate marriage, in the education that didn't feel aligned, that voice wasn't heard. That voice was ignored. And maybe they had no choice at that particular time in the culture. And so they devoured their daughters. We talked about this in The Wizard of Oz. It's the best depiction I've ever seen, really, of where Aunt Em sees Dorothy and sees her playing and happy and joyful. And she covers her mouth to stifle a scream because she realizes, oh my gosh, when I first came to the Kansas Prairie, I was like that. I remember. Oh my God, look what I am now. She was as gray as the Kansas Prairie. All life had drained out of her. And so this is what these dark feminine characters represent, the ones that have disconnected, the ones that have conformed, the ones that had adhered, the ones that had, taken that anger and pushed it down inside until it became something they couldn't contain. And you see this sometimes in older people who haven't been able to align to that and honor that. So this is so important, because if the mother actually succeeds, then the daughter just repeats the pattern and becomes those jealous stepsisters. And so the culture doesn't think too much of these qualities like jealousy and resentment and all of that. And so to actually find those in ourselves and acknowledge those in ourselves and understand that just because society says something isn't necessarily true. So society says these are bad qualities, But what they show us, as I've said before, is what do you really want? So what can happen is, because if there's this attempt to conform to up till a certain age, and then that voice, you start to honor that voice, then what happens is there can have been, if there was a period of time where there was this conforming, then it may be that you don't even remember what you want. Like that is buried in the unconscious so deep that you aren't even aware of it. For me, at the age of 30, I started having dreams about art, and I was completely perplexed. Like I had never had any inkling of talent in that arena. So to be dreaming about it night after night, I was like, what the heck is this? And why would I dream of this? Right? That buried in the unconscious that I had no clue. None. And so jealousy, resentment is pointing. Look there. It's buried right there. There's evidence. Your feelings are speaking to you. They're not negative. They're giving you information. Ignore what the culture says about it and look. Dare to look at what's been rejected, what has been discarded, what is unacceptable. Peer into that darkness and say, what is it about this that really stirs my feelings inside? What is that longing? What is that feeling? What is that for? What have I buried that wants to come out? So looking at those places and reclaiming that in order to find out what is it that's inside of us. No judgment. There's nothing bad about these things. There's nothing bad about rage. There's nothing bad about anger. It's covering something up. It's trying to protect you. It's like the Wicked Witch in Wizard of Oz, and she's trying to protect. She has strong boundaries. She's the protector. That's all that anger and rage is, protection. And so the more that we allow it and accept it and acknowledge it, okay, I got it. You're not feeling safe. Okay, let's find a safe container in order to process this and see what's underneath. What are you protecting? Little detective work here, right? So, I've lost my place. Where am I? Okay. To emerge from the unconscious, we reclaim the aspect of us, and then we're not projecting. We're no longer devouring the daughter. And so this can be literal, like as in a child. This can also be personal, interior. So this doesn't happen inside. So we don't do it inside. So, right? So you have these aspects of yourself, the rageful part. And if that's in control, then it is afraid to let that young feminine out because the power is still projected, because the belief that I have to conform is still alive. So this is important in order to allow ourselves to have that young feminine emerge, those gifts come out in the world. But these other things need to be cleared first. What part of you wants a place at the table is being excluded? So looking at the self, are there things that you are excluding inside? Like I noticed this before, how in myself, like how I was choosing silence. Like it was easy to see when I felt like I was being silenced. But when I noticed like, oh my gosh, in certain situations, I'm choosing to conform and stay silent. Now, we don't always, like I said, want to kind of go out there and just, let it loose wherever we are. But when we pull that, like understand that I have colluded in this particular area, we understand it, then we can stop feeling ignored and rejected by the other because we've accepted, we have chosen this path in this particular situation, and that we are doing it ourselves. And so this is not always the case, but if it's happening anywhere, we can look and see, am I doing it as well in any situation? Choosing to not express that part of myself. So the father, the father tries to protect the daughter, right? He represents ego in a sense, because the first thing he does to protect her is tries only inviting the good wise women. And then the one he excludes ends up cursing her. So that didn't work. And then second, what he does is he removes all the spindles from the kingdom. Well, that's how I'll protect her, which is ego control. I'm going to control this. I'm the one who's in power. I've got this figured out. Yeah, ego can't control it when it's fate and we're breaking a pattern. So that's not going to work. He thinks he's in charge. No go. Life shows him differently. Why does fate intervene? To break the pattern. Does it for us? Does it in the story? Does it in the culture? So if we have to say who has the power, as I said earlier, the king or the wise woman, we can see that the wise woman actually has power, not the ego, not the king. And so that's a key to remember in yourself and in the story. So what is he protecting the princess from? What is the ego trying to protect? The soul, because that's what the young feminine represents from herself, her view of him as the empowered one, and herself as not empowered. Like, what is he playing at here? Or is he trying to protect her from, like, we don't want you to be angry. We don't want you to be sad. We don't want you to grieve. We don't want you to be rageful. We don't want you to actually have emotions that we don't think are good. Or is he trying to protect her from the truth of who she is? And fate is more powerful than the ego. So there's nothing that can be done. The spindle and spinning are associated with the divine feminine. So if we say Venus was excluded from the story and transitioned from that myth to fairy tale, she no longer was there, then still we have all these references that go back to the divine feminine. And so the spindle represents this turning, right? More like the cycles of nature, the weaving of fate, creation, right? Fate there's this saying that, like, life wounds you, but then it also heals you. And so you might say, well, that's not really fair. Like, why would it wound me and then just heal me? Like, that's a waste. But what it's doing is, in a sense, it's the wound is to re-establish okay, this is my personal opinion in doing all this work and looking at all these stories. I think the reason why is, I might not be right, but this is what I think. It makes sense to me. Is that life reignites the historic ancestral pattern, right? They've even seen this in research with mice, that in successive generations, the trauma remains, even if the trauma isn't redone. But if the trauma doesn't happen again, then it's kind of hard to see it, and it's kind of hard to resolve it when you don't even know it's there. So other things can point at it, certainly by hearing family history and stuff like that, you can pick out the patterns. But oftentimes it is reintroduced. Again, it's like that stepmother kind of passing the pattern on to her jealous daughters, the stepsisters, right? That pattern kind of follows, not maliciously always, probably not maliciously really ever. It just is like the stepmother's conditioning just gets passed on by osmosis to the stepsisters. So we see this kind of passing on. So the wound happens again in order to heal the ancestral inheritance. So I have this theory that the ones who come into the biggest challenges are the ones who are the strongest. Setting karma aside, that, right? Because what does the body do? The body's not going to send in the weakest cells if there's a problem. It's going to send in the appropriate cells that have the ability and to resolve whatever is arising in the body that needs to be, rectified. Right? Doesn't that make sense? Doesn't that make sense that if life is good and if life is automatically moving towards greater consciousness, that, if you have a problem and you can send in, Superwoman, are you going to send in, Jane, plain Jane? I mean, no, you're going to send in the one who can really clean up this mess. That's you. So life is good. It sent you. So I have also, like I've said before, I think channeled poetry, and they say the same thing. They say basically life sent you. So the king thinks he's in charge, but he's not. So let's see, the spinning. Life wounds then heals to create consciousness, not victims. So that's also can be challenging, especially when you're in this 100-year waiting period, to not feel like you're doing something wrong, but you're not. You're going deeper and you're reestablishing a solid foundation in truth so that you can emerge and be you and not care about the rest of the world, not care what they think. So if there's a trigger, then that means power has been projected. So that's a good way to see them. And rejection is judgment about what the culture deems unacceptable for a good girl. Don't we see that again and again? It's crazy. But if all you need to do is really look around at our culture right now and see that the feminine, this emergence of the feminine, you can see some aren't real happy about it and are doing their best to play the role of the king. And that isn't so good. So we reclaim it inside of ourselves, resolve it inside of ourselves, find our power inside ourselves. So I thought I was going to do part 2 this week and we were going to be done, but I'm sorry to say, or happy to say, because like I said, it's so rich, such a rich story, that we are going to have to go week 3 in order to resolve it. For sure. I'm going to do my best to get through next week. Okay. Thank you for coming. Hopefully this is helpful to you. Saturday mornings, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Good luck and have a great day and a great week.